also covers one of the unit.
Yes, sir. It's part of our syllabus. I have told him.
Yeah. So I just thought I'll check with you. Okay. How was the morning? Was your internals today?
Yes, sir. Some students have had their internal today.
But you were not having anything, no?
No,
Is my
sir.
voice very clear and audible?
Yes, sir. But it's breaking in between, like for a second or two.
Oh, don't tell me. So I need to check that why it is breaking. Okay. Good. That's how I'll cross check with you again. देखो अब आवाज आ रही है. So since we are connected here only, no, so it will echo like this.
Professor C. Rajamohan, Ambassador Mohan Kumar, and Professor Madhu Bhalla to speak on a topic that is of tremendous interest, but let alone all those who are students of Indian foreign policy and international relations. But everyone here gathered, are so very willing to listen to our three eminent panelists on India at 75, the emerging world order and India's aspirations within that. So I don't want to spend more time. I am sure that people here are are eager to and looking forward to listen to the three eminent panelists. However, many of us have questions in our minds. And I would only say this much, that maybe 15 years back or 20 years back or even 10 years back, India wanted to be heard in the global forums. Now that's no longer the case. Everybody waits for India to speak, and they wait impatiently for India to speak, because India is already being heard. and heard very loudly all across the globe. So definitely there is a lot of achievement, and yet there are some aspirations as to how India is going to define the new world order. Whatever way we call it, it's going to be a new one in many ways. And we will leave this analysis to our experts. And we will go by the order of the speakers, which is already laid down in the poster itself. So I would take great pleasure in inviting Professor C. Raja Mohan to speak for 10-15 minutes, or around 15 minutes, to be followed by Ambassador Mohan Kumar and then Professor Madhu Balla. And at the end, we will collect questions for our speakers, and we will let them respond to all of this. So once again, a very warm welcome to everyone gathered here, and we'll really look forward to a very exciting evening. Thank you. And may I welcome Professor Raja Mohan to speak first.
Thank you, Professor Acharya. Thank you, Dr. Tiwari. It's a pleasure to be part of a distinguished panel like this, and to engage the students of the Delhi School of Transnational Affairs. So, in the when those of us who do international relations talk about order, for me, it's always important, I think, for us to remind ourselves that we are not dealing with the world of physics. I mean, as that this is not, when we talk about order, as if it gives us a sense of fixity, of clarity of the relationship between different components. But those of us, I mean, if you've done physics or maths, you know that. I mean, that when you say order, there is a certain laws, certain clarity that operates between different elements of the universe. But we are dealing with the world of politics, where human beings, human societies, and the nature of the politics cannot be simply shoehorned into a kind of order. That its order is something we academics impose on a messy world. I mean, so order is a way of understanding the broad trends in the international system, and we should never fall into the trap of believing there is actually an order, and what happens is how that changes is something as if it is a mechanical, physical process. This is not. This is a dynamic political process. Large number of sovereigns are involved. A large number of peoples are involved. Therefore, even in the most stable periods of the international system, like for all the talk about the liberal international order of the last post-Cold War era, critics can easily point out that there is not much of order, there was not much of liberalism to it, nor was it international in any sense. So we must be skeptical in simply accepting this nomenclature as some kind of a fundamental feature, like in physics or chemistry when we talk about atomic order or molecular order. So this is not like that. There is politics. Just since we're all in the middle of a major war, just say, who could have imagined that the president of a major power like Russia would embark on something as consequential as this, and increasingly clear without much thought or preparation or the expectations that he had in Ukraine. Therefore, the ambition, this is not just about NATO security and that kind of stuff, but this is also about ambitions leaders have. I mean, the idea of a Ruski Mir, or the Russian world, the Russian civilization. So Putin is trying, I think it's going to be a disaster, but I think he's trying to restore what he thinks is the legitimate sphere of the Russian civilization. But the world has moved on, and I don't think the Ukrainians were ready to accept to go back into Ruski Mir. And the imposition of this war actually will consolidate the Ukrainian nationalism, and Russia and Russian people will pay a heavy price. So individual ambitions, mistakes, errors, gigantic blunders continue to shape international politics. So we need to keep that in mind when we talk about order. But as I said, order is a way of thinking about the world, but it is not a physical description of the world that exists. So since what I would like to talk about is basically three aspects of India's role in this changing world. And let me deal with the question of great power relations, how India is adapting to that. Second, the question of globalization, economic globalization, and what India is going to, how India is going to deal with it. And third, I want to speak about multilateralism and the international institutions that exist. So basically, I'll stick to these 3 points. The other two panelists, I'm sure they have much deeper knowledge and they can cover much wider ground. So the first one, on the question of India's great power relations, much of our discourse on foreign policy, they talk about non-alignment or strategic autonomy, are fundamentally referred to the great power relations. I mean, that it's really, since independent India came into being amidst the emergence of Cold War during 1947-49, the foundational ideas seem so focused on how India relates to the dynamic between the great powers. Therefore, the emphasis on not joining blocs. But that policy of saying we are non-aligned, but today, as India itself becomes a large country, that in the past you can say, look, India was a weak, vulnerable actor that did not want to get caught in the great power politics as a newly independent country. Today, India is a $3 trillion economy with the fourth or fifth largest defense budget and third largest armed forces. So for India, simply to talk about neutrality, non-alignment makes little sense. And what has changed, I think, in the last 75 years is from being a mere pawn in the major power politics, that India has the capacity and the capabilities to shape the nature of the equation between the other powers. So your size matters, and that today India and China, which was seen largely barely $100 per capita in 1945 to 1950, today are reasonably capable countries. And China, of course, has now emerged as the second largest economy and a major power. India has some way to go. So how we deal with this world and how we relate to the other powers, it must be tempered by the recognition that India's weight itself makes a difference to the system. That is, we're not just a passive player there that needs to navigate between others, but the choices that India makes in relation, for example, I mean, today, both Russia and the US would want us to support them on Ukraine. So what India does will have an effect on at least some parts of this conflict, at least on the diplomatic side. So therefore, for us, we need to break out of this constant sense of are we non-aligned enough? Are we strategically autonomous enough? To one of saying an interest-based argument, what are India's interests and how does India relate to those interests, rather than starting from are we non-aligned? Are we sufficiently non-aligned? Are we sufficiently autonomous? Here, for example, while India depends a lot on the Russia, for example, its weapons, can there be neutrality between an India which has a trade worth $160 billion this year with the United States and $8 billion trade with Russia? That is the scale of the difference on the commercial side that today India's economy presents. While you still need the nuclear stuff from Russia, you might need the weapons. The idea that India simply is a question of being neutral between the two when a war takes place and when some of the sanctions will affect our economy. So India will have to make those choices in a complicated way rather than simply saying, are we autonomous or not? And related to this is the question of strategic autonomy, which is a concept that kind of animates our political class. But if you look at the history of Indian foreign policy, the strategic autonomy was always invoked only in relation to the US and the West. That is a context as a newly decolonized country, and the fear of returning to the Western domination always was a player, but it was not defined in abstract. That today it is a dependence on Russia that has actually constrained India's strategic autonomy on what we say and do on the question of Ukraine. So therefore, this notion that strategic autonomy, I mean, I want to highlight this. Look, I think everybody in the world tries to be autonomous. So this claim somehow India is a sole nation animated by strategic autonomy. We've shown Nepal shows a strategic autonomy when it plays between Delhi and Beijing. Maldives showed us that they can switch between India and China. Sri Lanka does it all the time. So the 101 of international affairs, every country tries to maximize its room for maneuver within a constraining environment, because there are multiple sovereigns within which each sovereign tries to expand its sphere of influence. So this is not about an abstract notion of strategic autonomy, and that no one has absolute strategic autonomy. And within the constraint that you have, each country is doing it. So it's not what India does is not some kind of an exceptional, special, that we all have to stand up and salute for. This is the fundamental feature of international affairs. The question is how well you navigate that, rather than measuring your distance from specific powers at specific points of time. The second set of issues, which is really on the globalization, I'm sure Ambassador Mohan Kumar will talk more about it. Here, I think we're at the cusp of a change. 3 decades ago, when India reformed, the question was how do we adapt to a new Washington consensus, or the new, world in which a whole set of new rules were being designed by the international system, defined by WTO, and opening up of economies. So that path that India took, that all of us in the last 30 years have found different ways of adapting it, sometimes kicking and screaming, sometimes crying, sometimes willingly, we've taught to adapt to it. But in the last few years, the government has outlined a strategy which is very different, saying we're not going to globalize uncritically, and that uncritical globalization has exposed domestic vulnerabilities in large parts of manufacturing. Therefore, today, when the current government talks about Atmanirbhar Bharat or Make in India and Make for the World, this is a fundamental shift from the policies of the last 30 years. So how we relate to global economy, that is fundamentally changing. And I think this is, I would think, far more consequential, both for creation of national capabilities, as well as for our standing in the world, rather than how we relate this morning to Russia and the United States and China. So this is where, in the end, your position in the international system is defined by your national capabilities, and the question of building national capabilities, but whatever you want to call it, this is different. And this is different from Indira Gandhi period, where we said, look, where we kept the foreign capital out, we controlled domestic capital, and we thought the state would do everything. Then we had 30 years of reform and liberalization, where we opened up our economy, but there were significant constraints on the way the domestic capital operated within our domestic sphere. But today what we're seeing is actually liberating the domestic capital and inviting foreign capital to do things in the country so that national capabilities are created. I mean, this is not a settled argument. We can talk about it, but the fact is this is a different strategy from the last 30 years and the previous, Nehruvian era, especially under Indira Gandhi. Finally, the third point I want to talk about is really the question of multilateralism. India, long a champion of multilateralism of the United Nations, WTO. But today, I think we are shifting from a blind faith in multilateralism to actually what you might call minilateralism. Whether we sit in the BRICS with the Russians and the Chinese and the Brazilians and the South Africans, or we sit in the Quad with US, Japan, and Australia, we moved away from a traditional emphasis of the collective non-aligned movement, emphasizing global institutions, democratization of the UN, to one where we are today protecting our interests in plurilateral or minilateral institutions, which is what we're trying. Of course, there is a tension between BRICS and Quad. One of these days, the tension will boil over. But the fact is, the simple notion that we are for UN, we are for WTO, those are going to yield place to coalitions where we're going to build and strengthen our positions. So I think I've spoken already for long. I think I'll stop here. But it's essentially asking our students really to don't buy into everything you read, don't begin to think a little more critically. And I would also add that looking at historic evolution of India, I think that's far more important, and I think we don't do enough of that how India dealt with the various situations. And I think that will give us, enrich us in terms of thinking the kind of crisis that we are dealing with today. But I would say this no other time, no other more exciting time than today to deal with international affairs, to learn about international affairs, because India has changed. I mean, India today, a $3 trillion economy with $1.3 trillion of exports and imports. This is an India, not one in which I was born. This is an India that's deeply connected to the world. So I think it's an exciting period to study international relations and transnational affairs, if you will. So I would wish you all great luck. And this is really, there should be a lot of excitement for all of you as we look ahead at the world and the multiple trends that are unfolding. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Raja Mohan. That indeed was a very realistic appraisal of what are India's contemporary challenges in a world that has already changed, and part of which India is already, part of that change itself. And what are our interests and what kind of actions we now take, or we should now forge, those coalitions, which may not look very neat, in a sense, in the sense that, when people were talking about the non-alignment movement and all that, some couple of decades ago, things were different then, and now things are very different. And looking at this, that whole data about how big the US is as a trading partner of India, still doesn't deter India taking a stand on other powerful actors in this world. And so this is something. So we are in a state of flux, and of course, order is dynamic. It has to be understood in a dynamic sense and not in a static way. And so thank you very much, Professor Raja Mohan. So these are things to think about. And as he warned at the end, students need to be a little more careful in drawing conclusions about, where we are and all that. And especially, that we need not draw very simplistic conclusions from this. But we also have in our midst, a truly great practitioner of diplomacy, someone who has represented India for almost 3 decades, and that is Ambassador Mohan Kumar. I still recall on the past, I've had some very wonderful conversations with him, and he has huge experience, and he can tell you stories just like that, about what he and Indian diplomats have done in the past and still do things now. And so Ambassador Mohan Kumar, I invite you to now engage the audience for the next 10-15 minutes or whatever time you please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Acharya and Dr. Tiwari, and thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure and an honor to go back to my alma mater, so to speak, DU. I have never addressed the Delhi University since I passed out in 1978. So I really thank the Delhi School of Transnational Affairs for this amazing opportunity. It so happens I just never returned, but I think this is tempting me hugely. I think when you make the meetings physical, I'll be happy to come over. And I also want to particularly agree with the last part of what Professor Raja Mohan said. I also agree with everything else he said, but particularly the last one. I have nothing but envy for the students in front of me. This is a fantastic time to be doing international affairs, looking at it and critically thinking about events. So I think Professor Raja Mohan has been at his eloquent best. I'll try to do other things and maybe look at the crystal ball. That's not always easy, but I'll begin by saying that this is a hinge moment. I personally think that the 24th of February 2022 may well be the date that future historians will say that the last nail in the coffin of the liberal order was struck, because that is when Russia invaded Ukraine. History doesn't move in straight lines, so it's very hard to say that one period ends and the other begins. But as Professor Raja Mohan said, and I completely agree, we live in a very, very messy period where the situation is fluid, and I think Professor Acharya, you referred to it as well. So who holds the cards? Ironically, I think China holds the cards in terms of the direction and contours of the emerging world order. And I say that because China faces a fork in the road. And if China throws its weight behind Russia, following the February 4 joint statement, then I think we are looking at a binary bloc situation in the world where you have a Sino-Russian bloc and then you have a NATO West bloc. India and ASEAN will engage in strategic hedging, but I believe that in the medium to long term, this kind of hedging will not only prove difficult, but it will prove to be unviable. So at some point, India will have to make up its mind as well. The other option for China is that it continues to pay lip service and then looks at its self-interest, which is at least the economic self-interest is tied with the West still. It's not like Russia. So it may well say, okay, we will try and do business with the United States and maybe help in the isolation of Russia. Even better, try to call out Putin and then bring the war to an end. I see this as being a little fanciful at this stage, but we have known bigger surprises in the past. So I think China has quickly realized that the joint statement signed on February 4 is not only imposing costs for China, but it is also circumscribing choices for China. That is what it has realized. It's no longer, there's no areas forbidden, no limits to the relationship. I think the world has its own way of teaching leaders and powers. And I think to some extent, that joint statement itself is under pressure, in my view. But it'll be interesting to see what China does in the next 2-3 weeks, in addition to, of course, what Russia and the West do to each other. There is a reasonable chance of China also cooperating with the United States. There are already voices in the United States saying Russia is the Satan, Russia is the devil, let's deal with China. That is a bit of a nightmare scenario for India. I don't think it'll go to G2, which is about United States and China shaping the rules of international behavior, but it may well be a situation where China and the United States cooperate where they wish or choose to, and they then compete and undermine each other in other areas. So that could also be a situation. But as I said, you should expect many twists and turns because, as I said earlier, history does not move in straight lines. What about India's outlook and what about India's aspirations? I believe India should try and do the following 3 things. Some of it is overlapping in the next 10 to 15 years. And I will then suggest how India should go about achieving those aspirations. The first aspiration for me, if I'm an international relations, wonk or a foreign policy wonk, we have to become a leading power rather than just be a balancing power or a swing power. So, that goes without saying. India should, I think, try to be a leading power, if not in the world, at least in Asia. So that's the first. The second, which follows from the first, is that we should be a rule shaper rather than a rule taker. And in particular, I have institutions like the WTO in mind, where we are completely on the sidelines of negotiations. We don't participate in the plurilateral negotiations. We are no longer shaping the rules. And on FTAs, we have walked out of RCEP. It's true that we have launched a flurry of bilateral FTAs, but at the end of the day, they will be bilateral FTAs. So if you ask me whether we are shaping the rules of trade, whether we are shaping the rules for digital trade, where we haven't been able to pass the bill in the parliament on personal data protection and things like that, I think, or sustainable development for that matter, cybersecurity, I would like India to shape the rules in this area, not just accept rules which are made by others. Lastly, and it also follows from the above 2 aspirations, I think if you agree that the world is going to be messy and a multipolar world, I think India should aim to be an independent pole in the multipolar world, not piggyback on some other pole is what I'm saying. I think we are a long way from that, but it's good to have that aspiration. In fact, it's good to have these three aspirations as we complete 75 years of independence. So first, be a leading power rather than a balancing power. Second, be a rule shaper than a rule taker. And lastly, occupy an independent pole. So what are the solutions or what are the measures that India must do? Professor Raja Mohan alluded to it, and I have said so many times. Somebody asked me what should be the foreign policy objective of India, and I just said 9% GDP for the next 10 years. It's as simple as that. Everything else pales into insignificance, because the two things that India has to do, and has to do it relatively quickly, is to become a 10 trillion economy as quickly as possible. Because at the present rate of 2.7, we can keep saying we are 2.7 and 3, but when you look at the market capitalization of Apple, and that is 3 trillion, then you start wondering, what the hell does 3 trillion mean for a country of 1.4 billion? So really, we should be heading towards 5 as quickly as possible, but a minimum of $10 trillion GDP is what India needs in order to exercise some clout. This translates into the money that we can spend in Maldives, the money we can spend on projects in Nepal, the projects we can do in Bangladesh, Vietnam, Sri Lanka. It is really strategic is what I'm trying to say. It's not mercantilist at all. Having a 10 trillion economy and being able to trade, because when I say 10 trillion, I need to tell your students that 45 to 50% of that is foreign trade. 45 to 50% of India's GDP is foreign trade. You're not going to be able to become a 10 trillion economy just by banking on the domestic market. So you have to trade, and you have to find ways to trade. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is, and I would request all the students, if they haven't already done so, to look at the Niti Aayog report of November 2021, the first report on multidimensional poverty in India. And it says very clearly, and I'm glad the government agency is saying this. This is a 2016 report which says 1 out of 4 people in India live in abject poverty. This is a good admission because it's a good place to be sober and start an assessment of what India is up against. This is a 2016 report, and therefore it is pre-pandemic. There are reports which talk of 200 million people who have joined the ranks of poverty post-pandemic. So we are looking at a staggering figure of 600 million people in India who live in abject poverty or multidimensional poverty. And this is something that India can ill afford. You cannot become any power, forget about leading power or a regional power. You cannot become any power with 600 million people in your country living in abject poverty. So this figure will somehow have to be reduced to at least 150 million, 200. We can live with that. I don't think we will be able to abolish poverty in this country as China has done, or extreme poverty at least, but I think we should reduce it substantially. So that is the first way to do the aspirations or achieve the aspirations that I'm talking about, becoming a leading power, etc., etc. So if you do this, automatically you will find other countries running to your doorstep, wanting a piece of your cake, market, and you will have many, many opportunities. Strategic opportunities will open up if you are a 10 trillion economy, is what I'm saying. It is not yet there. And that is why we are having to hedge our bets, abstain, cling to the coattails of other powers. We are having to do all this. It all boils down to this great number of people living in poverty and just the economy not being big enough. It's as simple as that. So I think that's the first thing you need to get right. Politically, I remember Pranab Dada and I were locked up in an aircraft for 6 hours. It's one of those things. I was a very junior officer, just joint secretary. But we had to go from Bangladesh to Nepal to Sri Lanka to Maldives to hand out invitations to the SAARC prime ministers and presidents to come and attend the SAARC summit. This is something Pranab Dada hated. So I had put up a 1-week plan to visit SAARC countries, and he said, Mohan, you've got to be joking. Just ask the prime minister for an aircraft. We will start at 4 o'clock in Calcutta, go to Bangladesh. By midnight, we were back in Delhi, and we had already handed out the invitations. He was the external affairs minister. Since I got fantastic quality time with a great man for 6 hours, I thought I got a master class in Bangladesh, which was fantastic. And I don't think anybody else could have given me a master class. I was joint secretary, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives. He made a very interesting suggestion. When we exchanged notes and I was becoming a little cynical about Indian democracy, and he also shared his cynicism, he said, the time has come for all the political parties to meet and establish a political consensus on a small number of topics which represent India's national interest, and those will not be politicized. Now, these could be economic reforms. These could be a plan to reduce poverty levels. This could be India's real national interest when it comes to United States. We all know the situation when Prime Minister Manmohan Singh had to put his office online to sign the nuclear deal, when everybody knew this was in India's abiding national interest. We have to avoid such situations. I know it sounds a little bit utopian, but if you're not going to dream at 75 years of independence, when are you going to dream? And if the students in front of me don't dream, who is going to dream? I think this is something we all should put pressure on the political parties, have a limited number of areas which are off limits for politicization. Look at what has happened in the farm bills and the farmers' protest. These are eminently sensible bills. And now we know that a majority of the farmers were not opposed to it, but it's too late. We haven't been able to do it. And what does this tell you about economic reforms in the country? How are you going to carry out difficult economic reforms if even a government with a thumping majority in the Lok Sabha is not able to carry out reforms? So this worries me. And frankly, one way out is to have an all-party meeting and say, listen, some things are off limits. Otherwise, what kind of a democracy are we if we are going to politicize everything in the parliament? Lastly, I would also say, in matters of social cohesion, I think there needs to be social cohesion. We have to find a way to achieve greater cohesion. I'm not saying we don't have cohesion at all, but I think efforts have to be made by everybody, not just political parties, but also man in the street. Everybody should contribute towards greater social cohesion, because that also contributes to comprehensive national power. So I'm going to stop here, Professor Acharya, and I hope I have sufficiently provoked your students, and I hope to have an interaction. But thank you very much for this opportunity, which again is the first time that I'm addressing students of the DU. So I'm pretty thrilled about this. Thank you.
Thank you indeed, Ambassador Mohan Kumar. This was a very, very powerful swipe at various things. But first of all, I would say that, speaking about the different aspirations, is something that has, that has been a very powerful message that, we just don't want to be a balancing power. We want to be a leading power, and we need to be a rule shaper. And, it's only with Ambassador Mohan Kumar's experience can we come up with this kind of a thing, where we say that actually, for a long time, we have been a rule taker. We have been passively accepting, all that has been given to us all this while. Whereas we have not gone ahead and actually shaped the rules in the multilateral agencies and institutions, including World Trade Organization and all that. If India won't, who else will? At this, this is the right time to think about forging, these kinds of roles for ourselves. And then the third one, that we aim to become an independent pole. Well, probably we are seeing the beginning of it now, and of acting not just as an independent pole, but I think, India has started to act in tune with its national interests, of course, as a responsible independent pole, not just an independent pole. And in trying to highlight, what are the domestic drivers of India's foreign policy, then we have three things to think about. And that is, of course, the first thing, as Ambassador Mohan Kumar says, is a robust economic growth, something to the tune of $10 trillion economy, which must have the reality check of trying to, keep down the numbers of people below the poverty line. And that there should be a political consensus, indeed, we are still waiting for the day when we really have that consensus. And somewhere I'm still hopeful. I think we are inching towards that. And, political consensus also, of course, comes with some bold initiatives by leaders at times. We can't just hope for it. And then, of course, the much desired social cohesion, because, and unless we have these three things going with us, it's difficult to imagine what kind of a powerful role we might play in global affairs. So, thank you, Ambassador Mohan Kumar. You have, and Professor Raja Mohan before you have raised the curiosity of our students and have, somewhere provoked them to think along these lines a lot more boldly than they may have done so far. And thank you so much. Okay, may I now turn next to Professor Madhu Bhalla, and have the privilege to our students listening to her on what she thinks about India is at 75, the emerging world order, and and India's aspirations. Professor Bhalla.
Thank you, Professor Acharya, and thank you, Vipin, for inviting me to this panel. I must say, though, that I think all of the interesting things have already been said. So I'm just going to say a couple of things that I think we need to keep in mind as we talk about India at 75 and India, in the future, and our strategy for the future, or our policy for the future. A few months ago, we were part of the Conference on Democracy, which was called by Biden, right? And we were one of the 111 democracies that were present at that conference. And I sort of wonder, looking at what is happening within India, looking at what is happening in terms of debates on democracy, the value of democracy, the nature of democracy, how democracies function and do not function across nations and globally and in global institutions. Whether at 75 we should be not be thinking very deeply about what democracy means to us and whether it is a value in the international system and it's a value for us to uphold within the international system. Right? We very often haven't done that, although we have called ourselves the world's largest democracy, the world's newest democracy, and all the rest of it, right? We haven't upheld that, say, for example, in Myanmar very recently. We have not upheld that in many other places in the world, but nor have many other countries upheld democracy as well. So, to have a conference on democracy, a global so-called global conference on democracy, and to be a part of it, makes you wonder what we think about democracy as a value, as a public goods in the global sphere, in which we have a stake, right? So my sense is that, while events are very exhilarating, a reflection on what these events mean and what these principles mean is somewhat lacking within our policymaking institutions and also within amongst our policymakers as a whole. So I would suggest that at 75, when we look at India and our trajectory ahead, we might want to figure out where, as the world's largest democracy, as the world's perhaps newest democracy, we want to go as a democratic nation, how we want to shape the global order or the rules of the global order as a democracy. And whether we want to keep that front and center in our conceptualization as we go forward. The interesting part, of course, is that Biden called for a renewal of global democracy. And I'm not sure that America was the right country to talk about a renewal of global democracy or about a stake in global democracy, doing what it has done in the last 20 years in West Asia, for example, elsewhere as well. To join the bandwagon, the American bandwagon, in terms of the US's concept of democracy and how it functions, may not be the right path for us to go. I think we need to be able to project how we conceptualize global democracy and how we conceptualize the functioning of democracy in the global sphere. This is part of an old debate actually in the post-colonial world, but I think it merits being talked about and being focused on and being discussed within our policy-making circles today. The second thing I think that we need to be looking at as we go forward, and I think both Raja Mohan and Mr. Mohan Kumar have talked about this, is multilateralism, but actually in a broader sense, interdependencies. One is, of course, the whole functional multilateral institutions, plurilateral institutions, smaller multilateral groupings, etc. But I think the idea that the world is really and truly interdependent, I think that is something that we have to place front and center in rethinking our foreign policy. It's not just a question of how we get along with the major powers, not just a question of how we get along with powers that irk us, but also how we get along with all of the smaller powers in our periphery and across the world as well. So in a sense, the interdependencies that are going to be significant in terms of policy, in terms of future globalizations, for example, I think these are very central to how we need to reconceive and at least sort of highlight in terms of our policy making and in terms of how policymakers look at interdependencies. I'll give you one very small example. We had something called the MOSM initiative some time ago. The government announced this MOSM initiative. And this was supposed to be some kind of a soft power outreach, conceptualizing the Indian Ocean world and the kind of overlays of history and culture, etc., across the Indian Ocean littoral. And yet, if you look at what has happened with this concept, it seems to me that very few discussions have been held on how we can reach out to partners in the Indian Ocean littoral in conceptualizing the MOSM initiative. After all, the Indian Ocean littoral comprises of many, many countries, small and big. Some were bigger historically, some were more important historically, some are not so important historically, but they all have a history related to the Indian Ocean. And yet we are very loath to partner with them to understand that the Indian Ocean littoral, the Indian Ocean domain was really one that was built on interdependencies and a great deal of interaction. So my sense is that this notion of interdependencies goes beyond the notion of multilateral institutions, goes beyond the notion of specific and short-term, even medium-term interests, but must have a longer reach in terms of long-term perspectives and how we deal with the rest of the world. The interesting part is, as editor of India Quarterly, we often get papers from authors on diverse parts of the world, right? We need to send them out for reviews. And when we look at people who can review, say, a paper on Nigeria or on South Africa or on Yemen, we rarely ever actually find people who can review them in this country. So there is actually, even at the academic level, hardly any focus on diversifying our notion of how we relate to which parts of the world, right? We could get any number of people who have all now become China experts. Everybody is an expert in China, so we can always get a reviewer on China. But we hardly ever get a review, say, on Argentina, for example, right? On Brazil, for example. And Brazil is a member of the BRICS. We are part of a multilateral institution in which BRICS is our partner. So really what I'm saying is that I think this sense of interdependencies, the sense of a bigger world apart from just the major powers does not exist either amongst our institutions, and it rarely exists amongst I think, large numbers of academics as well. So my sense is that sense of interdependencies has to be rethought and reconceptualized and put front and center in terms of our understanding of how we're going to go forward. And this also, of course, has to do with our neighborhood. I mean, we are constantly in our foreign policy concerns, especially in the media. The headlines really will tell you about Pakistan and about China. And we are trapped between the Pakistan and China syndromes that, that visit our frameworks. But it really is our smaller countries in the neighborhood that in many ways create the kinds of straitjackets that we cannot escape in many ways, right? So we've got to put out, small fires in Sri Lanka or in Nepal or in Myanmar or in Bangladesh, and we're constantly doing that. And there has to be some kind of a rethinking in how we deal with the neighborhood, whether we will partner with these countries or whether we will retain a sort of hegemonic, discourse that subliminally they think we do, right? So in a sense, I think that sense of interdependency is also closer at home, has to be much more significant. I mean, one of the examples of this, of course, is that, we talk about being a leader in renewable energies, right? We talk about how we are going to cut down on fossil fuel usage, right? We talk about joining the global solar initiative. And yet, I think we have not realistically thought about a regional solar initiative, right? What is our stake in that? What is our commitment to that? Do we put our money where our mouth is really in this area? And this could be a life changer and a game changer for our economy, for the economies around us. But I think the fact that we are so committed to our policy with Pakistan and with China, we really think about the world beyond this specifically. Finally, thirdly, I think that, we have had a host of initiatives that are linking us to new geographies. The Indo-Pacific, for example, very important, right? The Indian Ocean expanded to the Indo-Pacific, the Eurasia, for example. And I'm not sure whether we have integrated our policies on different geographies into a holistic kind of foreign policy agenda, right? There is a Look East policy, there is an Act East policy, there is, the oil pipeline thing with Iran and with Central Asia. All right, how do we integrate this into a framework of foreign policy for the next 75 years? Where are we going with this? Are we running after what China is doing? And every time I read something on this, there is always the comparison with China. How far ahead China is in Africa? How far ahead China is in Latin America? What China is doing in the Indo-Pacific. So this kind of a relational discourse that we have, our foreign policy in relation to what China is doing, it's always kind of a catch-up policy. Do we need to be doing that? We need to really reflect on that. We need to get away from that a little bit and see, where are we going as a country? And I agree completely with Mr. Mohan Kumar on, on the SDGs, on domestic policy, and the fact that the domestic drivers, the domestic events will actually drive our foreign policy in many ways. I think Kashmir, for example, the application of 370 has driven, has had some outcomes in terms of responses from other states to India. We need to, I think, be very clear that if we have a stake in the world, does the world have a stake in us, right? And I'm not sure that right now, apart from limited self-interests, the world actually has a stake in India. The world recognizes it as a potential large power, major power, but that's still at a level of potential, right? How do we create a situation where the world actually has a stake in us? right? In the values that we espouse, in what is happening in this country, in the future of India as well. To me, clearly, it does not seem that the world has a stake in us. I know the EU leaders come to India, and the Americans come to India, and we are part of the Code and all of that. But I think these are passing transitional strategic issues, which may not remain the same 75 years down the line, or even 10 or 15 years down the line. Because as Rajamohan said, the global order is a transitional, it's a dynamic order, it's changing all of the time, right? So the fundamental thing I think we have to figure out is, how do we create an India where the world has a stake in us as well, where it will come and invest in us, right? Where it will be willing to be part of our supply chains, where we can create a concentric circle of a concentric global economy, a concentric regional economy that will be as significant as the China-driven one in Southeast Asia or else. That is not very clear. I think the glimmers of that come through in some policy announcements, but as a concerted conceptual framework that emerges in terms of how we project ourselves for the next 50 years or for the next century, for this next generation of students who are listening to all of this and to their children after 20 years, right? I'm not sure that that's actually coming through. So my concern really when I read all of this is, how have we contributed to the kind of fractionalization of thinking on foreign policy in this country, right? And how do we contribute to actually clarifying some of the issues that are perhaps the most serious ones that we will configure in the next 10 to 20 years, right? The global economy, for example, is not going to be the global trading economy as we know it, right? We will not trade in commodities. We will trade in services to a large extent. And the cyber economy, for example, is very significant. AI and new technologies. These are not going to be brick and mortar economies. How do we deal with that? How do we prepare our students for that, our young people for that? And how do we configure our place in that economy? It is not sufficient to say that we are leaders in IT. Our IT economy only employs not even 20% of our population, right? The rest of the 80% is actually employed in farm labor or in physical labor and in lower level services. So where are we configuring this? Domestically as well as otherwise, and what are we congratulating ourselves about, right? I think like China, we should put our head down for the next 10 years till we get to that 8% or 10% annual growth. And we should not talk about India as a great power at all. We should say India is a country that has a lot of potential. Let's realize its potential in the next 10 years or so. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Valla. And this is a very sobering compliment to what Professor Raja Mohan and also Ambassador Mohan Kumar have said. And we needed this kind of a compliment, and we also needed to think along these lines because if we indeed hope to be rule shaper, as Ambassador Mohan Kumar was suggesting or hoping for, and if indeed we wish to bring about a certain kind of a political consensus in the country, Professor Bhalla is now raising a question. What about the world in which we live? And what about the interdependencies that we are part of? And it's not just reducible to some multilateral institutions alone. But what I suspect is that, Professor Bhalla, and I'm trying to put words into her mouth, but Professor Bhalla is somewhere actually hinting at, so what are our priorities actually? And in the long term, where do we want to see ourselves in the long term? And where do we want to be seen by others as to, what we stand up for? So in many ways, actually, even if she has not used the words, but I would say that she's somewhere very subtly suggesting that there has to be an ethico-political character of these interdependencies, and not just knee-jerk reactions to this or that country, this or that neighbor, but how do we build ourselves up in the long term, and with some sort of a balanced but global interdependencies in the deepest manner possible, so that we indeed emerge after a period of time as not just the rule shaper, but as, somewhere very rightly so, as thought leaders, of the world in some ways. And so this is indeed, all three speakers have done a tremendous job in trying to, highlight some of the ways in which this look at the future role of India or India's foreign policy, given the emerging world order. And after listening to all of this, I was reminded of one of the quotes of Sir Isa Berlin. What Ambassador Mohan Kumar was saying, that history does not move in straight lines. To that, I have a very apt quote from Isa Berlin, and he said that out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. and indeed, we can't look forward to a straight thing, but I wish we had a relatively straighter thing that will keep us going on for the next 10 years or 20 years, as Professor Balla says towards the end. And these are very, very fascinating, conversations, and these will become the resource of the Delhi School of Transnational Affairs. And we thank each one of you for contributing to the richness that the Delhi School of Transnational Affairs might stand up for at some point of time. And I guess it should be time now to open for the Q&A session. So, Bipin, how do you wish to go ahead with the organization of the Q&A? And we try have at least 2 or 3 questions for each of the speakers.
Yeah, I think so. We can just go ahead like that. We can ask the students to unmute and speak by one by their turn.
Or if they do not wish to speak up, and at times it can be chaotic, so they can also type in the chat box their questions and try be as brief as possible in writing out the chat messages.
Absolutely.
Chat is disabled, sir.
Chat is disabled. Okay, anyone who wants to come forward and ask a question immediately to any of the 3 speakers, or a question for all the 3 speakers, that's fine. Anyone who wants
Good evening,
to
sir.
Yes.
Am I audible, sir?
Yes, you are. Please introduce yourself.
Good evening, everyone. I am Avantika Agrawal, and I am a student of Indraprasth College for Women from DU. And my question, first of all, thank you for the really enriching insights, everyone. And my question is specifically to Ambassador Mohan Kumar, sir. So that a few decades back, our foreign policy often we see had to compromise somewhere between the conflicting factions. But now we are in the era of multilateralism, where we do not have to choose one faction. It is no more either this or that. We are more on the sides of this and also that. So broadly, my question is, in this exact era of multilateralism, how can India exactly shift or initiate this becoming the rule shaper or the world leader, along with divergent countries and the ideas that we have?
Yes, please go ahead.
So thank you very much, Avantika, and that's an excellent question. Actually, I will give my answer in 2 parts. One, as far as multilateralism is concerned, it's generally believed that multilateralism is in terminal decline, and the UN Security Council has not exactly covered itself with glory on this issue of Ukraine. And it's interesting, the United Nations Security Council is in crisis. The WTO is in crisis for very different reasons. We haven't had a single multilateral round of negotiations in the WTO since 2001. And the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is also in crisis because you've got people now outside of NPT who are now nuclear powers, and the NPT has not been able to adjust its rules to suit or to take into account India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea. North Korea, of course, is part of NPT. So anyway, what I'm saying is it is one of those synchronized multilateral crises. It's not just a question of the United Nations alone facing a crisis. So I think it's fair to say that multilateralism is in terminal decline. So how does India therefore become a rule shaper? And I'm answering the second part of your question. I think it is not, I don't see India getting into the Security Council with a veto as a permanent member. And in any case, as I said, the multilateral institutions are in terminal decline, along with the ending of the liberal international order. So what India has to do now is get into plurilateral arrangements. There are a lot of plurilateral arrangements that India is part of, beginning with the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which is the most famous of them all. But you've also got the trilaterals that we have: India, Australia, Japan. You've got India, France, Australia. You've got a Resilience Supply Chains Initiative, which has been launched by the Commerce Minister, Piyush Goyal. I think this is the way to go forward. The catchword is resilient. And really what it means is you trade with countries which can trust each other. You do business with countries with whom there is trust. This, in my view, gives an opening to India, because traditionally we've had difficulty agreeing to or negotiating in the WTO. So this should be actually, at least theoretically, much easier for India to negotiate. For example, and this is something I'm writing about as well, but why can't the quadrilateral also be a free trade agreement? We already have an FTA with Japan. We are on the verge of having an FTA with Australia. So already with two partners, India has FTAs or about to have FTAs. It's only United States. So why can't US, India, Australia, Japan, the quadrilateral security dialogue partners, also have a trade agreement among themselves? They're doing a lot of other things, which are fantastic. At the end of the day, my theory has always been that you need the ballast of trade in order for strategic partnerships to perform at its best. Otherwise, like the Indo-US relationship, the weakest link is trade and technology and IPRs. So I think you need the ballast of trade. And if we cannot do a bilateral free trade agreement with the United States, which seems very, very difficult because there is no traction in the Biden administration for a trade agreement, at least let us do plurilaterals. And in the area of digital trade, I'm particularly happy that India, along with Japan and Australia at the Paris meeting, has agreed on some broad outlines of digital trade. I found it extremely interesting. We haven't been able to join the Osaka track because data flow without any impediment is a problem for India. We believe in data localization. So I think it's interesting that India has finally thrown aside its cautious approach and has decided with Japan, Australia, India, New Zealand. I think we've got something going. At least we have agreed on a declaration from the Paris Indo-Pacific meeting. I think that is the way forward. We must establish new rules in digital trade that India can live with. And there, at least, let us be rule shapers. You know, it's very difficult to be a rule shaper in the WTO for us because, as I said, we are not even party to the plurilateral agreements, frankly. But let us at least try to capitalize on the resilient supply chains. Let's capitalize on the fact that China is not the flavor of the season. People want to get out of China, and India will offer an opportunity. But so far, I see only Vietnam grabbing all the opportunity. Something has come India's way, but not much. I think India should, but for this, I go back to my original point. we have to carry out deep economic reforms in land, labor, logistics cost, the ease of doing business. I do not see this happening unless there is political consensus in the country. The farm laws are not great advertisement in that regard, frankly. So somehow we will have to find a way to carry out those painful economic reforms. Look at power sector. We penalize. This is the only major country which penalizes the industrialists. Industrialists pay more for power than you and me, which is absurd. So I'm sorry, it's a long-winded answer for a good question, but I really think it goes back to what we can do domestically. And while multilateralism may be in terminal decline, I think there are opportunities in plurilateral groupings. We are doing great, by the way, in plurilateral groupings. The fact that the Chinese foreign minister is coming to India, I see, Professor Raja Mohan would know more, and I will always, on this, I will completely bow to him. But it seems to me he's coming for a saving face kind of thing. He wants PM Modi desperately in China. This is the only reason, BRICS Summit and RIC and so on, because Xi Jinping himself wants to get a term. I don't see any other reason, but I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
I don't see any chats, so I guess people just want to speak up. And who's next?
Am I audible?
Well, Kandi Venkatcharan, K. Venkatcharan, is that, did you want to speak?
No, sir, I want to speak. Anushka, I have a question. Am I audible?
Yes, please introduce yourself, Anushka.
Okay, I am currently pursuing my master's from Delhi University under College Mata Sundari. And my question is a little general and more practical. So the question is, since most of us are going to step into the field of research, now from a perspective of policy research, which area is least researched and can help in, this motive of making India a rule maker? So it's a very selfish question also, but yeah, I think with speakers who have such great experience, they can help really, they can help us out, give us direction.
All right, Anushka, I'll just throw it open to anybody, whoever wants to answer it. But I would tell you that as times change, also the, policies also, are seen a little differently from time to time. But anyway, maybe Professor Raja Mohan would like to take that question.
Yeah, I would say, look, almost everything is under-researched. So there is really, I think while India has become far more connected to the world, our research we're not doing enough on a whole number of areas. So I think the trick, if you want to be a policy researcher, I would say, look, take any area which you like, which you enjoy doing it. You get deep into it, you get a sense of, mastery over it. Once you do that in one area, it's easy to widen it out, build out from that basic expertise. So I would say pick anything you take fancy to at this point, but go deep into it. And that anything you go deep in, will reveal you the structure of India's international relations. And once you have that general sense, then those can be applied easily to other issue areas, because each one has its own specificity. But I would say pick anything you like and go deep into it. Spend some time. That's what normally we do in PhDs. But after that, you can actually broaden out far more in a relaxed and comfortable manner.
So I have a follow-up question to this, to give it more context.
If it's a quick one and a brief one.
Yeah, it's a very a specific one. If I talk about in context of Pakistan and their sub-conventional war strategies, now how can India in this case become a rule maker? India finds itself a little helpless because they employ militancy And despite we having more conventional strength over them, we are still not able to influence or make the rules of the game.
You want me to answer?
Yes, please. Yes.
Just 3-4 days ago, the Army Chief of Pakistan, General Bajwa, supposed to have addressed the students of LUMS. I don't know, you might have heard of LUMS. Is one of the best institutes in Pakistan, Lahore University of Management Sciences, where he's reportedly had said that, look, Pakistan has lost the battle politically and strategically on Kashmir. So we don't know if it's accurate reporting or not, but at least there's some thoughts. 2 days later, you have Imran Khan telling the Organization of Islamic Conference that Islamic cooperation, look, I think the world has let down Kashmir from his point of view. So this idea that we have no options is not true. And in fact, this subject of India's conventional superiority neutralized by Pakistan's nuclear weapons, that issue has been hacked to death. I mean, you can say that. I mean, scores and scores of people have worked on stability, instability paradox, what happens in between India Pakistan, the escalation. But you saw August 2019, where India changed the internal constitutional changes in Kashmir. Then you had before that, you had the Pulwama attack and India's response. So I think India has raised the level of deterrence. I mean, that is quite clearly has happened. And more importantly, I would think, India has altered the international balance of forces in relation to the India-Pak dispute. And that again has come through a shift in balance of power. Today, India's GDP is 10 times bigger than Pakistan's. Pakistan's GDP is even smaller than Bangladesh's. That Pakistan's ability to mobilize the rest of the world to put India under pressure has significantly declined. And I think that's a change. Again, that takes you back to core principles of balance of power, that if you had a strong economy, others' stake in you has risen, and Pakistan quite happily making enemies out of its friends. So I think I would dare to say, the terms of engagement on Kashmir have been fundamentally altered in the last few years. So as I said, nothing is static. And my sense is just the transition. If you look at that context in the last 30 years, there have been profound changes. And that tells you something about balance of power. That tells you something about changing relations of great power relations with India and Pakistan. That will tell you something about, why the West needs India more than Pakistan, and why, as we speak, last 2 days, a Gulf delegation, Arab Gulf delegation, is sitting in Srinagar talking about investments. So I think you can see this is where strategy, political will, and deployment of resources can alter even seemingly impossible situations.
All right, thank you. May I just remind everybody here, all those asking questions, that didn't you think it was good manners to come on the video screen and make yourself visible while asking questions? I think that's the rule we followed when we were doing the classes, that at least when you're raising questions, please make yourself visible and then raise a question. That's always seen as good manners, right? Okay, I hope you will all agree with me, unless you have a very bad whatever day, So, but we also, we miss Hars here. He's caught up in something very significant. But we also have with us, 3 Kannad postdoctoral fellows, and Raj Sharma is one Kannad postdoctoral fellow. Beena is another, and Junjun Sarma Pathak is another. So we have 3 Kannad postdoctoral fellows, and we are also looking to invite some associate fellows from some of the Delhi University colleges to the Delhi School of Transnational Affairs in future. So Raj, Beena, and Junjun, if you wish, you could just come up on the screen and say hi to everyone, please, if you don't mind.
Raj is very much here, sir.
Oh, Raj is there? Yeah, because I didn't see a separate thing for him.
Right.
Okay, Raj and Beena and Junjun, please make yourself visible. But in the meantime, let's have questions. Oh, Beena is also there. Okay. All right. Okay. Any other question for Professor Bhalla? Oh yes. Hello, Junjun.
No, sir.
Yes. So, any question for Professor Bhalla, or any other question from for Ambassador Mohan Kumar, Professor Raja Mohan? Anything from our our postdoctoral fellows, our research students? This is a wonderful opportunity, I tell you. You don't get to meet such luminaries every now and then. And of course, we look forward to inviting each one of you physically, to the campus and to our school. And we have just begun. And there's, during the pandemic, there was no, and then, so this was the first major, event that we have had.
Can I suggest something here in relation to the last question?
Yes, please. Yeah, because you have a tremendous experience of having reviewed so many articles and everything. Yes, please go ahead.
I mean, just talking from that experience, I'm sort of wondering why our students, why not many students work on Africa. I mean, I know that Delhi University has a Department of African Studies, right? A lot of that has to do with Indian diaspora. I mean, I see a lot of the studies that come out of that on the Indian diaspora and Africa and all the rest of it. But very few studies that actually look at what is happening, in, say, domestic politics in Africa. What is happening? How are African states shaping their foreign policies, right? What are likely to be, the strategies or the needs for Africa in the next 10 to 15 to 20 years? Where do we plug in to an entire continent that is perhaps going to be the next, opportunity for the world, right? My sense is that a lot of people just shy away. They do the easy things on Africa. They don't do the really difficult things in terms of getting to know the nitty-gritty of politics in South Africa, or say in Nigeria or in Kenya or in the smaller African states, sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm sort of wondering why that is. Because we have had a long tradition of Afro-Asian unity, the Bandung, all of that, non-alignment. We also have a lot of African students who come to study in India. Unfortunately, they don't have a great experience here in terms of race. But it's always a question to me, because I think it's an exciting continent to work on right now. And so are the new regions that are opening up to growth and to development and to new ideas, like Africa. And Africa is just across the pond for us, right? In a sense, I mean, just across the Persian Gulf. It's not that far away. So I would suggest that, if you're looking for an area to work in, you might want to work on Africa. You might want to look at the SDGs. You might want to look at the future economies. You might want, because these are countries that are going to actually catapult themselves into the new economic, categories. So this is a question that constantly sort of haunts me. Like, why are young people only looking at Pakistan and China and the rest? That's fine. I mean, these are important to us. But I think what's going to be more important to us by the time they finish their research is going to be continents like Africa. And, so that's one suggestion I would like to make is begin to think about things that are going to be important to us in the next 10 to 15 years. So you will stand at the point where you can actually be able to interpret that to policymakers. That's basically.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone with a question or?
I think Rachna has raised her hand. Maybe okay. Rachna, yeah.
Rachna, yes.
Yeah, Rachna Narayan. Rachna, you can ask.
Good evening, everyone. I am Rachna Narayan. I am a PhD student in Delhi University. Sir, I am interested in knowing the relationship of India and Nepal, and how is the growing relationship of Nepal in China is very much interested in Nepal nowadays. So how is this changing the relationship of India and Nepal? I want to know this. Thank you.
So, anyone who wants to answer this?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think implicit in your in your question is the sense that China got only interested in Nepal recently. No, not at all. Nepal has two neighbors, India and China. And there was, before communist China, there was imperial China, there was Qing China. Nepal, in fact, always had interesting relationships with both to the northern neighbor as well as the southern neighbor. In fact, if you read, there's a good book written in quite some time ago, but it gives you a history of Nepal's, foreign policy book by Leo Rose on Nepal. A fabulous account. I mean, it traces it back to at least the last 200 odd years. How Nepal always sought to balance its relationships with the south and the north. And in fact, it's very interesting to know that how Nepal, for a short while at least, tried to support the Indian princes fighting the British. That was before the Calcutta became a powerful force. And they were constantly moving towards, they had good relationship with Tibet as well as with the emperor and with the princes of India. So it's only when the British Raj became all-powerful force that Nepal chose to ally with British Raj in Calcutta, while Qing China began to decline. So the idea that India was the dominant power was a feature only of the last 100 odd years, and the rise of China, re-rise of China, is challenging that. So when you have two neighbors, that's a beautiful example of non-alignment, what Nepal does. And even more interesting is the fact that when you have powerful neighbors, how the domestic politics, connects to, you have strong factions in Nepal politics, which are deeply hostile to India. The others, which are very pro China, there are also factions which are close to India. So I think it's a fascinating case of geopolitics, of how do small states look at the big neighbors, how do small countries play balance in politics. And if you want to take the Ukraine case, I mean, there's no, in fact, I keep telling everyone that how much Russia says, look, they were insecure, that they were forced into invading Ukraine. It's like India telling Nepal that, look, you don't have a right to exist. You've always been part of me. A lot of Indians say that, unfortunately. Nepalese are just like us. They're part of the great Mother India. Therefore, why you separate sovereign? I'll just take you over. So a Nepalese, of course, moment to say that. I mean, even you try to do smaller things, they revolt against it. So I think Nepal, for all its seemingly marginal case, it encapsulates some core aspects of international relations and balance of power, spheres of influence, transborder connectivity, and how, if you look back at the history of Nepal, not just in the last few years, that Nepal had this long tradition of playing both sides. And when the southern part became strong, they tilted to the south. And when the north has become strong again, they're playing again between the two sides. And I think we should have a lot of respect for the Nepali geopolitics. And I think any study of that will give you a lot of entree into the bigger picture in international affairs as well.
Thank you so much, sir.
Anyone who wishes to add to that a little bit? Okay, any other questions?
Rahul Raj and Abhishek Dangi have raised their hands.
Oh, okay.
Abhishek, you can start, please.
Hello. Yeah, good evening, everyone. Hello. Yeah, my question is a general one. I would like to ask.
Please introduce yourself, Abhishek.
Myself, Abhishek Dangi, and I'm currently MA Political Science student from ARST College. So my question is, what are your views relating to India's stance on this Russia-Ukraine war? I mean, is it the most pragmatic step that we are taking of defining our interests in a more clear and and or are we going against our principles of not supporting the national sovereignty, or will we keep the West at displeasure by doing this? Because since our war with China, and in future we may require the rallying of the West on our side for this. Yeah, that's the question. I mean, I want to ask your views on this.
Okay.
Thank
Thank you. Thank you. Maybe we will have Ambassador Mohan Kumar to respond to this question.
Okay, so thank you very much, and it's a very hard question as well. Everybody is talking about it. Everybody's writing about it. I personally think that our position was determined by three things. One was a core interest, which was the presence of 20,000 Indian nationals in Ukraine. Fortunately, that has now been finished, and that's now been over and done with. The second was a strategic interest in which it's well known that we depend on Russia for military supplies. And lastly, of course, there is a principle at stake, which you alluded to, which is sovereignty and territorial integrity of nations, the UN Charter. I don't see the Indian position as static. And in fact, if you see the beginning, the first statement that the PR read out in the UN Security Council, and we are, as you know, a non-permanent member of the Security Council, we talked about security interests of various countries. Now, when you read an expression like security interests of countries, we are talking about Russia's security interests. Let's be clear, we are not talking about Ukraine's security interests. We are talking about Russia's security interests, which presumably is determined by Ukraine remaining neutral, etc., etc. But if you see the subsequent statements, we have moved on to sovereignty and territorial integrity, and we have shed security interests. And I think we have started saying more and more, shall I say, strongly that cessation of hostilities is important, etc. What we have not done is an outright condemnation of Russia. I don't know the views of my illustrious two co-panelists. My sense is that we are not in a position, frankly, for an outright condemnation of Russia. It's not wanting to, and that is irrelevant in international relations is not a beauty contest. It's not about principles at the end of the day. Yes, principles will play a role. At the end of the day, your own interest. And I just happened to go to this think tank called CLAWS, C-L-A-W-S, Center for Land Warfare Studies. I mean, I had not planned it, but they called me. So then I said I might as well take advantage of this opportunity. All of them were retired generals and captains and from the army. What they told me, for me, was very surprising. I had a fair idea that we are dependent on Russia. But for example, the Air Force has 35 squadrons, 29 of them are dependent on Russian aircraft. Anything to transport troops and foodstuffs to people in Ladakh, completely Russian aircraft. Battle tanks on the land, that is in Ladakh, etc., completely Russian. We make battle tanks in Avadi. But he tells me very nonchalantly that while we make these tanks, 8 important spare parts still continue to come from Russia. So frankly, my assessment was, and I told them very bluntly, we have made a hash of it. It's very naive and stupid for India, knowing that Soviet Union was disintegrating, it disintegrated. We have done virtually nothing to diminish our dependence. You know, Rafale is being made much of. But when you come to think of it, it's only 5 squadrons out of 35, which is Rafale. So I think the ordnance factories have been a bit of a mess. All of them agreed with it. So my answer to you is, at this stage, you can talk of principles. But now, whether even this will satisfy Russia, that's a different issue. But I think even Russia knows we couldn't have done more to extend our support to them. gradually over time, I think this is a wake-up call for India. That's the way I see it. We have to diminish our dependence somehow, because without battle tanks, what are you going to do? You have borders with Myanmar, you have borders with Pakistan, you have borders with China. What are you going to do without battle tanks? The other thing is, you used an expression, rallying the Western world next time China attacks you. That I am very clear, that nobody is going to put boots on the ground for India. I don't think we had any expectation that in Ladakh that will happen. What we have received is valuable satellite intelligence from the US. That is extremely important. On the other hand, illustrious foreign service officers who have served in Russia will point out to you that Russia did not penalize you when you had this battle with China. They continued their arms supplies. So they will tell you, no, look at this. Even when you had this thing with Russia, they continued to give you. Now, the other question you will have to slowly start looking at is, just as you are dependent on Russia, perhaps the right question to ask is, where else can Russia also sell these weapons? This is what we have to ask ourselves. The relationship has now become transactional in any case. They sell, we buy. It's not free. And I think we have to dramatically reduce dependence. But I think we should also start asking, where else can they sell these battle tanks? Pakistan is already being served well by China. They don't need it from Russia. So I think, frankly, that is a question you have to ask. As far as buying crude oil from Russia is concerned, we were merely doing perhaps a little bit more blatantly what Europeans were already doing. So as even Jen Psaki was forced to admit that, I don't think we were violating sanctions when we bought crude oil at 30% less. But I think the medium to long-term outlook for defense is critical. And it's a wake-up call. And I think at this stage, let me put it to you, subject to what my other two co-panelists feel, I think actually we have done a brilliant job, frankly. The US may be displeased, but that's not my problem. I mean, US is not going to fight a war in Ladakh. US is. So I think even the US understands. Yes, President Biden called us shaky. Next day, somebody has said we are an essential partner. We will live with this kind of thing. Yes, we have not been able to satisfy our Western friends in its entirety, but what can you do? Sorry, that was a long-winded answer, but I thought I should make it clear.
Thank you so much, sir. Sir, can I come up with a follow-up question, please?
Let's first have anybody who hasn't raised any questions so far, and then we will come back to you, time allowing, Abhishek.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Do we have any more hands up, Bipin?
I'm just trying to figure it out, sir. Rahul
Okay, there is
Raj
a chat. There is something that has come up in the chat box.
Yeah, in Modi's era, it seems India's democracy. Just let me open it, sir. Just give me a moment.
Is
I'll read the
declining.
Yeah, I'll just read it from there. There's a chat question in the chat from Vidyanand. He writes, in Modi's era, it seems that India's democracy is declining. Then how it's possible to be a rule shaper? In my view, democracy is our identity.
Would anybody in particular wish to answer this question?
Yeah.
Professor Balla?
Okay.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Look, democracy is a virtue. I think as an Indian democracy, we should always strive to better it. But democracy and rulemaking, the connection is a bit tenuous. The fact is, today China is the second largest economy, has greater influence on rule setting on a large number of areas than India has. So I think these two are separate areas. So I don't think you should mix the two. That if you're a powerful economy, you get to, or a powerful military actor, you can set the rules. That being a democracy is a bonus, but not really necessary. It's not a necessary condition for being a rule setter. That doesn't mean democracy has no value. That's our internal political organization. That's a value we strive for its own sake, not because it helps us set rules or others are going to like us because we are a democracy. Because for India, its own good, that's what we say. Democracy is our internal preference.
Okay, Professor Bhalla, since you were speaking about global democracy, did you wish to respond to this? Professor Bhalla, am I audible to you?
Maybe a network or something. Maybe she'll join.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, can I take another question?
Yes,
And then I think, sir, we should. There'll be no limit to the questions. So I'll take another question, sir. This is from my student Nitin Gupta. He says, "Good evening, everyone. I am Nitin Gupta. I am a political science from Kirurimal College. I have a very specific question from Ambassador Mohan Kumar. Why China at 73 is way ahead that India at 75? Why India always remained emerging and never really emerged?"
Okay, so this will, if I may, Professor Acharya and Dr. Tiwari, no, this will deserve a separate 2-hour session, but I'll try and be very brief.
Absolutely.
This reminds me of, I think you have various ways in which this joke is told, but I will do it in my own way. I think there was a Chinese ambassador in Sri Lanka who met with one of our diplomats, and the Indian told the Chinese that, listen, what do you think of India? We are an emerging country, etc., etc. So the Chinese apparently said that there is tremendous potential for India, and that will continue to be the case forever. This is what the Chinese diplomat is reported to have said. Kind of insulting, if you like. It may just be an apocryphal story, but at the end of the day, this is the question. I think there are a whole lot of reasons, but I can think of 2 or 3. One important reason is that they were able to transfer farm labor into factory labor by investing in education, health, and skill. We did not do that. They did it far earlier than us. And that is the way most of the East Asian economies have developed. You have surplus labor on the farm. You have to skill them. You invest in their education and health, and you make them work in factories for Nike shoes and Nike footballs and underwear and t-shirts. And, that is what you can do with farm labor. You can't make farm labor into computer engineers overnight. And China has done a tremendous job of it. The second thing the Chinese were able to do is, I think, carry out very painful economic reforms, which I am now pessimistically coming to the conclusion that India is not capable of. Because we allow vested interests like a few farmers from Haryana, Punjab to stop the farm laws. We will allow a few vested interests to stop our joining RCEP. This is, in China, there was painful economic reforms. Do not kid yourself that when China joined WTO, there was no pain. There was tremendous pain. You have to go to China and talk to people to know. People went bankrupt. People were jobless. People overnight were thrown out of jobs. Those are the kind of painful sacrifice that is necessary for a society. However, it is a chicken and egg problem, because that painful sacrifice is possible only if your people have a social safety net to fall back on, which we do not in India. So it's a chicken and egg problem. We have not created a social safety net. We have not invested in health and education sufficiently. So we have not been able to transfer the excess farm labor to factory. So our manufacturing remains at 15%. As a result of this, our manufacturing remains tremendously uncompetitive. So frankly, there are a whole lot of other reasons, but these are the most fundamental reasons. And I would say the most fundamental reasons are economic. And you can never believe that China carried out reforms only 10 years before India. And 10 years, I thought was a very short period of time, and India can catch up. But we haven't been able to do it. Look at the amount of labor still dependent on agriculture in India. It is way too much. It's still 50%. And you can't really pick people out of poverty. The last reason, of course, is as a result of all this, today in China, they claim there is no extreme poverty. They say we have managed to abolish extreme poverty. Yes, they have 600 million people who still live on $1,000 a year. That is true. like many people in India, but they don't have extreme poverty. Whereas in India, we still have, as I said, 600 million people. So I think I will stop here because this requires a separate, seminar by itself, this comparison between China and India. And I agree with your contention that even if you're a very proud Indian, don't let anybody argue with you that India is anywhere close to China. That would be simply stupid. There is a difference between China and India, at least a factor of 1:6. So anyway, thank you.
All right, thank you. And we have two more questions, and these are the last questions for this evening. One is by Jyoti, and the other is by Rahul. Jyoti is a master's in political science student, or have you completed? It says MA Pol Science. Okay. Is peaceful neighborhood imperative to? Is peaceful neighborhood an imperative policy to emerge as a leading power? How can India manage it? Is Jyoti's question. And Rahul's question is, why does the USA is always seen as a major player in international politics, despite the wrongdoings?
Excuse me, sir. I also have a question. I have been trying to connect again and again.
Okay. So why?
Wait. Let Ashok sir finish his questions from the chat.
So why is the United States always seen as a major player in international politics, despite the wrongdoings done by the US in third world countries through, in particular, the Bretton Woods system? So these are so there is a question on the peaceful neighborhood. Is that an imperative to emerge as leading power? And the second actually takes a swipe at the United States. And we can have responses. So who was that? Kundan, did you say that you had also a question? Was it Kundan, Vipin, or who was it?
I think
right.
it was Kundan only, sir.
Okay, Khushi Rajput has also raised her hand. But let us first have responses to this, and then Khushi, yours should be absolutely the last question. Okay. So anybody who wants to, so Professor Bhalla, would you like to take any of these questions?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last question from Khushi. What was the question?
No, Khushi hasn't raised her question yet. We are looking at the two questions in the chat box, the last two, one by Jyoti Krishna and the other by Rahul Raj.
Yeah.
Well, yes, to the first one, yes, of course, a peaceful neighborhood is very imperative to emerging as a leading power, definitely. But the point is, you can't order a peaceful neighborhood. And the strategies that we have so far, employed and our neighborhood policy so far, even by our own reckoning, the reckoning of policymakers within India itself, is that it hasn't really worked. Partly it hasn't worked, I think, because we have, we are not an economic center which can draw our neighbors to us to the extent that China has become. Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, you are audible.
Yes, ma'am, you are audible. You are audible, ma'am.
Yeah. So essentially, what is it that we have to offer? I mean, the narration of our initiatives in our neighborhood actually stumbled on the fact that we offer a great deal, but we don't actually implement our projects. So the neighbors are clearly comparing us to China, which promises and delivers, and we promise and we don't deliver. Secondly, I think our neighborhood policy is also complicated by the fact that we have a long history with our neighborhood. And so China doesn't come with that baggage to our neighborhood, in the sense that with Pakistan, we have the baggage of the creation of Bangladesh. With Nepal, we have had a long history of being implicated in their internal domestic politics to a large extent, and it polarizes Nepalese politics towards India. So we are looking at very large burden of history which we have not been able to extricate ourselves from. And the only way we can extricate ourselves from that is today we become an economic power that promises and delivers to our neighbors in much the same way that China does today. And I think in that sense, we might have actually a neighborhood that thinks of us with some goodwill rather than thinks of us in terms of anxiety and security fears, etc., and playing us off against China. But then again, that again is a nature of small nations. They will play up one big state against another big state because they have such huge asymmetries of power, and that's a reality that we cannot overlook and we cannot actually wish away. So in a sense, we need to work with that sense of asymmetry of power, with those kinds of anxieties, but we need to be a little bit more reassuring in terms of what we can actually provide to our neighbors as well. So that's the neighborhood. It's hugely complicated, and it is again very dynamic because the neighborhood has also changed as we are looking at it. Myanmar has changed, and its politics is extremely volatile. Bangladesh, in fact, has better indicators in terms of social indicators than you have. So it's clearly, treading a completely different path. Pakistan has made very clear choices, which you will have to live with. And Nepal is clearly hedging on both ends. So, and you can't say to Nepal not to hedge, with China and with India. So in a sense, it's a very exciting neighborhood, but it's a neighborhood in terms of their well-being as well. So that's my take on our neighborhood.
Can I come in? Unless Ambassador?
Yeah. Please. Yes.
Look, on the neighborhood, I mean, China has had a great run, but we're also in a situation today, the two worst performing economies in South Asia, Sri Lanka and Pakistan, went totally with China and ruling out other options. Today, they find themselves in a terrible economic mess. So, for example, just give you, it's not a great economic metric, maybe $1 will get you 180 Pakistani rupees today. It will get you 75, 76 Indian rupees. And the dollar today will get you 280 Sri Lankan rupees, 280 Sri Lankan rupees. Both these countries are broke by being recklessly saying we won't do anything with India, but we will do things with China. So I think there you are. It's no standard formula for our neighbors as well. I think some of them, Bangladesh has been smarter. Bangladesh exchange rate is around still $1 is equal to about 80 or so Taka. So it is how the choices the neighbors make are also part of it. But I would agree with Madhu that, look, all great powers try and pacify the neighbors. Forget peaceful. If they can pacify, create a sphere of influence. How do you create a sphere of influence? It is either by co-option, seduction, conquest. These are the standard ways. But if you can't, do seduction, co-option, coercion, or, draw them, attract them to you, this is what Russia will end up. You think you can send in your army and then you invite the whole world against you. So I think in our neighborhood, I think we need to find that, magic solution where we make it easier for them to integrate with us and that our growth can also benefit them. I think there is a recognition of these issues today. I think there's some improvement that's beginning to happen with Bangladesh, but we also got to remember in the subcontinent, the legacy of partition, the scars of partition are so deep, and overcoming that is taken almost 75 years. We're not there yet. At least on the eastern side of the subcontinent, at least some legacies of partition are being overcome. With Pakistan, it's much harder. So I think there is a peculiar context in which India finds itself in, that the consequence of partition are played out very badly. And then India's own past economic policies, that in India that was closed market was of no use to its neighbors. But today, I think you're trying to change some of that, but it's going to take some time. On the second question, look, what matters is power in the end. what is that famous saying? Everybody dislikes America, but Yankee go home, but take me with you. That power and attraction is what makes the United States. I mean, it is still all those of us who thought America is in decline. And when I was in college, like you, back in these 60s and 70s, Americans were on drugs and they were hippies and they were Beatles and rock music, all the stuff that was going on. Everybody thought America is finished. By 75, America was back, pushing Soviet Union back, finishing off Soviet Union a few years later, doing a deal with China. So I think it is the overall economic weight. I mean, this is where we talk about comprehensive national power is what matters. Within that, big powers make big mistakes. Some of them recover from those mistakes. Some of them can't. But that's the reality of the world. I mean, you can't escape that. So don't get into this. We can leave that to the divinity department. I don't know if you have a divinity department in your School of Transnational Affairs. We must study religion and ethics. All that is fine. But the real stuff is, look, it is power that does a lot of things, unfortunately. And those who have power, comprehensive national power, not just talking about military. Russia has a lot of military, but it can't translate that into economic power or soft power. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. It can be a nuisance, but it is of no value when its economy is smaller than that of Bangladesh. So I think this is where the US military strength, economic strength, its great universities, its soft power, continue to allow it to dominate the world. And I think that's where we are. And I don't see that changing anytime soon.
All right, we have someone waiting to raise a question, Khushi Rajput. With your permission, can we take this last question by Khushi Rajput?
I need to
yes,
go after
Khushi.
Good evening, sir. Good evening to distinguished panelists. So my question is related to what Ambassador Kumar mentioned a while ago. So there's an argument that I came across recently that that justifies India's dependence on Russia's defense equipment and systems, which says that Russia is the country which shares technical know-how as well of these defense equipments as opposed to the Western countries, especially USA. So in that respect, what really are India's options? Like what are the alternatives in terms of how India can diversify its defense related dependencies on other countries other than Russia? So that's my question.
So very briefly, if I may, since I asked the very same question, I don't think I'm knowledgeable on this issue, but I did ask the Center for Land Warfare Studies, CLAWS, the same question. They told me it will take them 10 years. This is according to them. I also raised my eyebrows when they said that, but they said, no, this is the minimum period that is necessary. As for your point, it is true that Russia has been one of the few major powers that has transferred technology to us. But I think if we have a new strategic partnership with France, and I'm somewhat familiar with that country since I was there as ambassador, I think France has a medium-term plan whereby they wouldn't be averse to transferring technology to India, provided we give them the right climate for investment. Now, the right climate of investment and I'll stop here because I think we are out of time, it will depend on acquisition of land is one important thing. Second, ease of doing business. Third, and the most important is investment dispute resolution. That is a huge issue for India. We don't believe in international arbitrators because we have lost every single arbitration case abroad. So our model investment treaty now says that you have to exhaust the domestic judicial process and then go abroad for external arbitration. You have to be a lunatic to do that with the Indian judiciary, frankly, if I may say so, because it will take years and years for dispute resolution. No investor wants to do it. So if we provide the right kind of environment, and I know that some negotiations are happening between the two countries, I think we have made it abundantly clear to France that we cannot continue to buy Rafale aircraft like this, that they have to make it in India. In other words, the Franco-Indian relationship has to change from a buyer-seller relationship to an investor relationship, investor-investee relationship. I think that can happen. And I see that as the only possibility. With the Americans, what you say is right. They have no, or what you hint is right. They have turned out to be unreliable. Thank you.
All right, we have. Thank you all very much for your patience and with the questions. I think we have come to a close on the Q&A, and I invite Dr. Beena to propose a vote of thanks. Beena, are you around?
Dr. Acharya, I have to leave. I'm going to leave.
Okay.
So may I start? Thank you, Professor Ashok Acharya, sir. Now, on the behalf of Delhi School of Transnational Affairs, I would like to take an honor, and it's my pleasure to give a vote of thanks to all the renowned and distinguished guests and panelists for making time in their busy schedule to speak with us on the very important topic, India's at 75, the emerging world order and India's aspiration. Thank you so much to all the distinguished guests for sharing and sharing your valuable ideas with us and enhanced our knowledge. And it was really a wonderful session. And I also extend my gratitude to all the respected program coordinators and as well as the members of Delhi School of Transnational Affairs. The first is the director of DSTA, Professor Harshpan sir, the joint director of DSTA, Professor Ashok Acharya sir, and the OSD of DSTA, Dr. Vipin Kumar Tiwari sir. And I would also like to thank to all my wonderful participants, students, scholars who patiently listened to this session and raised valuable questions. And last but not the least, I would like to thanks to all the employees and the IT staff of DSTA for their hidden and unconditional support. So once again, on behalf of Delhi School of Transnational Affairs, thank you to all for your patience and time. Thank you.
So thanks again from the DSTA to Professor Raja Mohan, who has already left, but Ambassador Mohan Kumar and Professor Madhubala. Did you want to speak just a word or a line? We really appreciated your giving us this time and for encouraging our students to think along at times new lines and provoking them to put their thinking caps on. So thank you very much to each one of you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.